I'm now going to bring up someone who needs no introduction, so I'll just simply say his name. We're going to have Ed Lazere come up, and he's going to talk to us about the DC 2018 budget, outlook, and issues. Once again, get your questions ready.
All right. I have to work my own technology here, which is very scary. There we go. Well, good morning, everybody. I want to thank you all for being here, and particularly all the partners who helped put this on, and Jared for speaking. I would like to start by saying that I'm nowhere near as funny as Jared Bernstein, unfortunately, but I will do my best. In fact, I'm often described, or my work is often described as being wonky, or I'm being described as wonky, as if somehow that's something I should be ashamed of, when in fact, the fact that you are all here is a clear sign that we all understand that the decisions that the mayor and council make over how to use over the budget are really important to making sure that our city's resources are being used for the things that we all care about, and particularly being used to help our residents in need. So I'm going to bring the conversation down to the DC budget. Pull up my notes here. So as the title of our event says, this is a time of great uncertainty for the district. We are no doubt a vibrant and growing and changing city. Yet we also know that many residents are being left behind, particularly those in communities of color. Our loss of affordable housing is staggering, and it's undermining the stability of our entire community. Addressing these challenges is important to ensuring that all DC residents can thrive, and also to maintaining our cultural, racial, and economic diversity. There are, of course, other challenges too, and I particularly think of the challenges of Metro. Everyone relies on Metro, from the children who need to get to school, to adults to get to the jobs, to businesses that need to make sure there's a healthy transportation system for their workers and their customers. So in this way too, the vitality of our city is being challenged. And as if those local challenges were not enough, DC faces imminent threats from federal leaders who are keen on lots of things: scaling back safety net programs, cutting other funding that states and cities rely on, fiscal threats against sanctuary cities, and as we read in the paper today, specific threats right at us, DC residents. And unfortunately, the district faces constraints that limit our ability to address these challenges as we get ready for the 2018 budget. It's not that our revenues aren't rising, there's no doubt that they are. Yet we have fiscal policies that have been adopted by our own leaders that tie the city's hands when it comes to thinking about using those resources. So as I'm going to talk about today, it is my hope that Mayor Bowser and the DC Council will take steps this year to address these constraints to give us more flexibility to address the challenges that we face. So let's start with a quick overview of the DC budget. I could pull up many, many indicators to show how strong our economy is, and I'll just highlight a couple. Our population is growing. We've added 100,000 residents in the last 15 years, something that 15 years ago was just a dream. The number of jobs in the city is growing, and the average income of DC residents is growing as well. So I'll just show you one chart that reminds us that the number of jobs in the city is growing, particularly the number of jobs in the private sector. This economic growth is, of course, really good for the city, right? We have more jobs, our tax revenues are rising, but this growth alone is not guaranteed to help all DC residents. And in fact, as development and gentrification are spreading to more parts of the city, we know that many residents, particularly Black residents and long-term residents, are many times becoming victims of our growth rather than its beneficiaries. The next chart reminds us that the typical Black household makes just 1/3 of what the typical white household in DC makes. And this next chart reminds us that there's a geography to our poverty as well, that even though we are a growing city, poverty east of the river is actually on the rise while it's declining in the rest of the city. Amongst these challenges, probably our number one is our affordable housing challenge. The district has lost more than half of its low-cost housing in the last decade, And we're making substantial efforts to create more subsidized housing, but it feels like every year we're just struggling to keep up with what we're losing. The next chart reminds us that housing costs are rising while incomes for many DC residents are not. So I'll just let you stare at that for a second. So as a result of these stark trends, incomes that are not rising, but housing costs that are, a growing number of residents are spending half of their income and sometimes as much as 80% or more of their income every month just to maintain their housing. As a result of these trends, we know that 1 out of 5 DC children, that's all children across the city, is now in an extremely low-income family that spends more than half of its income for rent. And the most obvious impact of our affordable housing challenge is, of course, our growing homelessness problem, which again, our city is making substantial efforts to address, but facing challenges keeping up. But the homelessness is really just the tip of the iceberg, right? We know that thousands and thousands of DC families are in unstable and unaffordable housing, and that this has devastating ripple effects on our community. We know that families with unaffordable housing spend less on food than other families. We know that children who move frequently or who live in overcrowded housing often fall behind in school and are more likely to drop out than other children. We know that low-wage workers who are forced to move because of unstable housing are more likely than others to lose their jobs. And we know that people who are stressed by high housing costs are more likely to report being depressed. Of course, there are lots of other urgent needs in the city as well beyond our affordable housing challenges, and you're going to hear about that a lot in our next panel. That includes adults needing support to gain literacy skills, a lack of high-quality childcare and other supports for families with very young children, a TANF time limit that could push thousands of children into deep poverty this year if it's not addressed, inadequate summer school and after-school programs, and many more. I'm sure there are many others in the room who would have things that they would want to add to that list. So these are our local challenges, and as we all know, we face severe federal challenges as well. And I am often asked, what do we expect from the federal government? What's it going to mean for our budget? And the answer is we really don't know. It's very unpredictable, and that makes it especially scary, right? We don't know what the president and Congress are going to try to cut, and we don't know how successful they will be or how successful we will be at slowing them down. But we know that health care is just a start, and that the threat for the Affordable Care Act is real and could mean as much as a $500 million cut to health care services in the district in just the first year. But one thing we can be pretty certain of is no matter what happens, it's not going to be pretty, but we also know that we're unlikely to really know where we stand with regard to the federal budget until after we've passed our own budget. We're going to adopt our budget this spring, but Congress will be continuing to do its work most likely over the summer and fall. So with challenges like these, I think you would all agree that we just need flexibility in the district over access to our resources to address these challenges the best way possible. Yet today, districts, our leaders, the mayor and council, really must operate with their hands tied behind their backs when it comes to budgeting. And to be clear, this has nothing to do with Congress or federal rules. It has to do with us, with policies that we've adopted. And there are 3 constraints, 3 ways that our hands are tied that I want to talk about today. The first thing that ties our hands is known as tax cut triggers. 3 years ago, our leaders adopted a policy to prioritize tax cuts as the city's revenues grow over investments in things like schools, housing, health care, or other things. Now, the good news, as we've talked about, is that we have a strong economy, and that means that our tax collections are rising. Now, normally, when you're in a situation where you're bringing in more tax revenue, policymakers and citizens have a choice. What do we do with that extra revenue? Do we invest more in schools? Do we invest more in health care? Do we invest more in housing? Do we give some of that back to residents and businesses through tax cuts? Do we do some combination of the two? That's the normal situation. But the actions taken 3 years ago by the district's leaders took away that choice and instead dictated that growing revenues would all go to fund a series of specified tax cuts for residents and businesses. Under this policy, as the city's revenues rise, new tax cuts are automatically triggered into effect. So far, about 100 million tax cuts have gone into effect, with another 140 million to go. And the next chart just tries to help you see what that means. So I do want to spend a minute talking about these tax cuts, where they came from, what they are. Oops, let's go back. They're actually from recommendations made by the DC Tax Revision Commission a few years ago, and I was honored to serve on the Tax Commission with Mayor Williams and others. And we made a number of recommendations for changing the city's tax policy, particularly reductions in taxes for low and moderate income residents. When our recommendations, or if our recommendations are fully implemented, the taxes paid by the poorest DC residents will be lower than in any other jurisdiction in the country. That's a great thing. And that's why I was happy with a lot of what we came out with at the Tax Commission, although I didn't support all of the recommendations. So to be clear, the issue isn't the tax cuts that we're talking about. The issue is more the pace and method of implementing them. I want to be clear, and maybe this is getting back to the wonky, that with these tax cuts in place, we're limiting the revenues that we have available to spend on other things that we might care about. And that's what this next chart is intended to show. I'll let you stare at it for a second, and then I'll tell you what I think it means. So this chart shows that when the city's economy has expanded in the early 2000s and then between 2010 and 2014, our revenues were growing pretty sharply every year. And again, that was more money for things like schools, housing, healthcare, potentially for cutting taxes. But with the tax cut triggers in place, we have greatly limited how much our revenues are going to grow for many, many years, making it much harder, therefore, to take advantage of our growing resources to invest in other things that we might care about. And I think it's important to note that tying our hands this way is a challenge because we just don't know what our needs are going to be at a given moment. We certainly know a lot of what our needs are, but from year to year, we certainly don't know. So I want to point out a few examples: metro and schools. Over the next year, because of rising enrollment, particularly in charter schools, but also DC public schools, our schools are going to need about 6% more in revenue after adjusting for inflation just to keep up with growing enrollment and new teacher contracts that are expected. And we, of course, know that we need to invest a lot more in metro, and the amount that the city has already committed represents an increase of about 11%. Those are both way higher than what our revenues growth is going to be allowed to be if we keep the tax cuts in place, meaning that we don't have the resources, we're not bringing in the resources that we need to keep up with growing challenges, and that's what this chart helps show. So I think I want to move on to our second constraint, but I hope everyone understands that with this policy in place, our choices over the next year in the 2018 budget will be very limited. So the second constraint, the second way that our hands are tied I want to talk about, happens when the city ends the year with a little bit of extra money in the bank, known as a surplus. Under current rules, the only choice when we have a surplus is to put that money into savings. Now, DC can have a surplus at the end of the year for lots of reasons, just like you might have a surplus in your own budget. So imagine that maybe your heating bills were a little bit lower than you thought because it was a warmer winter than expected. Or maybe you set aside money to fix your car and then you didn't need it because the car didn't break down. Or maybe you budgeted for a trip that you ended up not going on. That year-end money, that surplus in budget terms, to be clear, is different from the ongoing revenues that triggers tax cuts under DC policy. The year-end surplus is really unique to each year's circumstances, and it's unpredictable from year to year. So for that reason, year-end surpluses can only be used for one-time expenses, things like building schools, building affordable housing. So what might you do if you found that you ended the year with a little bit more money in your budget? Maybe you would replace that really ugly beat-up sofa that you've been staring at for too long. Maybe you'd fix the roof that is past its prime. And really the same thing is true for the district as well. With a surplus at the end of the year, we could do things like put more money into affordable housing, put more money into building schools, putting money into the startup costs for paid family and medical leave, which is going to need upfront money to get started. And I should say that we are likely to know, if not today, then tomorrow, just how much of a surplus the city ran for 2016. So we'll know how much money is potentially available to invest in those sorts of things. But unfortunately, under current law, spending the surplus really is not a choice. We must save every penny until we build reserves to specified levels under current law. Yet our reserves are already at a record level, and our finances were just ranked to be 9th best in the city among major U.S. cities. A save-it-all policy has definitely helped us get to this point and has therefore been a helpful fiscal policy, but it's not clear that it's needed now. So the next chart just reminds us just how much the city's savings, our fund balance, accumulated surpluses have grown. The fund balance is the fancy term for it. So we now have $2.2 billion in our fund balance, in our savings, and that's grown by over $1 billion in the last 6 years. So the third constraint I want to talk about, I don't know if I can really call it the third hand tied behind our back, but the metaphor breaks down a little bit. The third constraint is that we have no easy cushion in our budget to respond to federal budget cuts that, again, are likely to happen but are a bit unpredictable at this point. If there are substantial federal cuts, we do have reserves that we can tap into, but they all have strings attached to them. The biggest string is that for most of the reserves, if we tap the money now, we have to pay it back within 2 years, which doesn't really help us weather a crisis like cuts in federal budget. So what do we do to address these three constraints? We have 3 challenges, and there are 3 solutions as well. So the DC Fiscal Policy Institute has long recommended that the approach the city should take is a balanced one. That if our revenues are growing, it's okay to spend some, it's also okay to do some of the tax cuts. And particularly with the surplus, if we have surpluses at the end of the year, it's also okay to spend some and save some. But as we've talked about, that's not what we've done for the last several years. We've focused entirely on using our growing revenue for tax cuts as well as year-end surpluses for savings. So for 2018, we have 3 broad recommendations. The first is that we put the automatic tax cuts on hold, that we delay all tax cuts for 2018 and use those resources to address the challenges that we've talked about. Doing that would mean at least $70 million more available to the mayor and council and to all of us to think about putting more money into things like housing, schools, metro, and other. The second recommendation is to put on hold the policy that puts all of our year-end surplus into savings and to make a conscious decision to spend some of that money, again, on things like affordable housing, building more schools, and getting paid family leave up and running. And a third recommendation is to also take a portion of that year-end surplus and to put it in a very special fund just for 2018 to help us cope with the scary and unpredictable cut in federal funding that we're expecting. To have a fund that's there specifically to get us through 2018 so that if the federal government cuts funding to the district a lot, we can get through 2018 and give us some time to adapt to the new federal fiscal reality. And there they are, the 3 recommendations. Yay. So I'm going to end there, and I appreciate, again, you all being here, and I'm happy to take some questions before we move on to the next panel.
Hello, Ed. Okay. You probably know what I'm going to ask, but I agree that the automatic tax cuts should be abolished, and that requires revisiting the 2014 legislation. But the sheet that was handed out indicates 26 million in imminent triggers to be implemented. 9.4 million of that goes to raising standard deduction and personal exemption, which is actually should be seen as part of the safety net, because this provides income directly in the pockets of working class folk who are suffering from income insecurity. So my question actually is, why not look at this whole challenge as an opportunity and implement tax hikes on the top rate to match the likely Trump-Ryan tax plan, and that would give us a real big cushion, plus the other great proposals you're making.
Well, I do think we need to first start with decisions that we've already made about not doing any more tax cuts for now and putting them on hold. And I think we should put on hold any tax cuts that haven't yet been implemented so that the mayor and council have more choice over what to do with the budget for the coming year. Your question about what we might do to raise taxes, if the Congress cuts federal income taxes, I think is a conversation we can take up when we get to that point. I think it's certainly a reasonable idea that if the Congress is cutting taxes on DC residents as well as cutting funding that we all care about, that potentially one way that we can make up that is to think about raising taxes. But I don't think that's a conversation for the 2018 budget. I think that's a conversation that we have once we have a better sense of what the federal government is doing.
I think we should be more proactive.
Thank you.
Hi, Rochelle Bobroff, Legal Counsel for the Elderly. Looking at the list of automatic tax cuts, I certainly agree with your point. I was wondering if you think there might be any room for targeting expansions in Schedule H for our lowest income residents. Schedule H is one of the few programs that looks at housing costs and compared to incomes. So you had a wonderful slide there about incomes going up 0% while rent is going up 35%. And there were some absolutely fabulous improvements, going from 13 to 14 taxes, but since then, the changes in Schedule H have been targeted more at middle income, and wondering whether that might be a vehicle specifically to target the people whose rents are rising.
Yep. So for those who are not familiar with Schedule H, just to say a bit more, it is a tax credit for low-income homeowners and renters. For homeowners, it's intended to help offset property taxes when they're high relative to their income, and for renters when their rents are high relative to their income. And it is an important tool to helping people who are struggling with rising property taxes, as well as a general tool to help people who have unaffordable housing. And we, the DC Fiscal Policy Institute, have long advocated a stronger increases in Schedule H, and I think that's an appropriate use of the city's resources going forward. And I think your comment, Rochelle, just points out the challenge we face, that as long as we've constrained ourselves by first doing other tax cuts, we have limited resources to invest in anything, including investing in a stronger Schedule H tax credit.
I'm Gene Solon from Southwest DC. I was absolutely impressed with both presentations, the one by Ed and the one by Jared. I'm sure that both you guys want there to be more than we have at present, job skills training for both young people and people whose hair is as gray as mine. Could you please use the phrase job skill training when you talk about education, and job skills training when you talk about good jobs for all? I miss seeing that kind of phrase in all of your slides.
Sure. Well, thank you for bringing that up. It was not intended to suggest that that's unimportant. In fact, there are probably lots of folks in the room, including the DC Fiscal Policy Institute, who put a lot of energy into trying to strengthen the city's education and job training programs. And the next panel is also going to, I would assume, actually talk about that issue as well.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ed. We certainly agree that you all have done a great job, and I certainly agree with your recommendations. We want to be very effective advocates in promoting this agenda. And to do so, I think we also need to understand what was in the minds of and actions of our legislators that does not put a cap on how much goes into the rainy day fund, I think is the common name referred to it. So can you help us understand why there was no cap put on that? Why do we need so much money in that reserve so that we can have a better conversation with our legislators?
Yeah, well, I appreciate that question. And I think it's important because it highlights that I don't think, and I don't think anybody else in this room would think saving money, putting money aside for rainy days is a good thing. No one thinks it's a bad idea. Right? So the goal that the city set 5 or 6 years ago was to have enough cash on hand to get us through 2 months.
Right.
And it's not an unreasonable goal.
Right.
But the real question that we have stated from the beginning and that we're stressing today is why that's the only goal for our savings. That as we have a surplus every year, and we already are doing a very good job of building up our reserves, why we continue to have to put every penny of our reserves into savings rather than a policy that helps continue to build our reserves, but also let some of that year-end surplus go, be spent for productive uses.
Okay, so part of what I need, Ed, is the current amount that's in that fund, does that meet that cash?
We're not there yet. I think when the surplus is announced for 2016 in the next day or two, we'll be closer. The goal is 60 days. We have about 49 days of cash in the bank, I'm told, and we'll be higher than that. I don't know exactly how much, but we're not there yet.
Oh, all right.
Hi, my name is Allison Carner-Brown. I'm with Teaching for Change. I'm also here as a Ward 7 resident. I have two questions for you. So one is, can you give us a sense, so let's say, assuming that everybody in the crowd here said, yes, let's do it, let's go. So what would the next steps be? And if you're going to talk about this later, or if this will be addressed later, that's fine. But is this, drafting a bill that we all need to push at the council, pressure the mayor? Just what's your sense of how this actually needs to be enacted? Because this is a major proposal, very clearly. And then also, thinking about our elected officials who don't necessarily always act with what we believe is our best interest, what could you see would be the arguments against doing any or all of these that we should be anticipating?
Great. Again, thank you for your question. We will talk more before the end of the day of how people can get involved, but I think the main issue is this conversation was intended to make sure everyone understands where we are and the policies that are tying the city's hands so that we can all better communicate with our policymakers, with the mayor and the council. And so I think the next question is, how do we make sure we tell them that these are the things that are important to us and that we think it's okay to modify the city's policies in these ways to give us more choices about how we use our growing revenues to meet the city's challenges. And the second part of your question I've already forgotten.
Oh, yeah, so assuming we wanted to do this, what might be some of the arguments against doing any or all of these that we should anticipate?
Well, I mean, I can guarantee you that that somebody will say, and I don't necessarily know who, but someone will say that these are, at least the first two, are fiscally irresponsible, that we should continue moving forward with the tax cuts. There probably will be some concern that if we stop the tax cuts, that maybe they won't all get implemented. So perhaps and certainly the argument we're making is that we support many of the tax cuts that the Tax Commission recommended because they do create a fair tax system. It's just we don't think that this is the right year to move forward with tax cuts, that we have other needs. In the case of using the surplus, there's no doubt that certain city officials will say that 60-day goal of cash on hand is super important and we should just keep rushing to get there. And I think the answer there is it's fine to be moving towards that goal, but it doesn't need to be our only goal. That if we have a surplus, let's spend some of that. Let's add a few more days of cash into the bank, but also let's free up some of that money to be spent on other things so that we can say we are building our reserves, but also putting those reserves to other uses as well. Any other questions? All right, thank you very much.